On December 29, 1977, in a quiet Sacramento suburb, a man named Ambrose Griffin was unloading groceries from his car when a single bullet struck him in the chest. There was no argument, no robbery, no motive that made any sense. The shot came from a passing car, and the shooter did not stop. How does a random drive-by killing in a neighborhood with almost no violent crime become the opening act of one of the most disturbing murder sprees in American history? The first real clue took investigators nearly a month to connect, and by then, 4 more people were dead. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll walk through the exact timeline. 5 victims across 2 crime scenes, 1 suspect the FBI would later study for decades, and 1 detail found inside a refrigerator that still shapes how profilers evaluate psychotic killers today. Detail number 3 is the one investigators say they can never quite forget. If you follow cases like this, subscribe. We cover a new one every week. To understand what happened in Sacramento between December 1977 and January 1978, you have to understand the man at the center of it. And you have to understand him without romanticizing anything. The press would eventually call him the Vampire of Sacramento. That nickname has followed him for nearly 50 years. But before he was a headline, Richard Trenton Chase was a deeply mentally ill young man whose warnings were missed, ignored, or actively dismissed by nearly every system that encountered him. Richard Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. By the accounts of family members later interviewed by investigators and by biographer Ray Biondi, the retired lieutenant who supervised the Sacramento homicide investigation, Chase's childhood was marked by escalating behavioral problems. Biondi and co-author Walt Hecox, in their book on the case, describe a boy who displayed what forensic psychiatrists have long associated with early warning signs of severe pathology. As a teenager and young adult, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. By his early 20s, he was convinced that his blood was turning to powder, that his heart was periodically stopping, and that his internal organs were shifting inside his body. These were not metaphors. He believed them literally. In 1975, Chase was involuntarily committed to Beverly Manor, a psychiatric facility in Napa County, after being found in a hotel room in an extreme delusional state. Staff at the facility later reported, according to court records reviewed after his arrest, that they had nicknamed him Dracula because he had been caught catching birds through his window and, according to those staff accounts, drinking their blood. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was medicated. And in a decision that would later be scrutinized in painful detail, he was released in 1976 into the care of his mother, who, according to Biondi's account and multiple subsequent reports, weaned him off his antipsychotic medication because she did not believe he needed it. By 1977, Richard Chase was living alone in an apartment on Watt Avenue in Sacramento. Neighbors described a thin, disheveled man who kept to himself. What they could not have known was what was happening inside that apartment. Investigators would later find the walls stained, the refrigerator full of things that should not have been in a refrigerator, and evidence that Chase had been experimenting on small animals for months. He believed, according to statements he later made to psychiatrists, that consuming blood was the only way to keep his own body from disintegrating. This is the man who, on the evening of December 29, 1977, fired a .22 caliber rifle from a moving vehicle and killed a 51-year-old engineer named Ambrose Griffin. Griffin had just returned from a grocery store with his wife. He was carrying bags into the house on Robertson Avenue. The shot came without warning. Investigators would recover the bullet, but at the time they had nothing else. No motive, no suspect, no pattern. It looked like a random, senseless act of violence, and for nearly a month, that is exactly how it was treated. Then came January. On January 23, 1978, a 22-year-old woman named Teresa Wallen was home alone in her house on Tioga Way in East Sacramento. She was 3 months pregnant. Her husband, David, would return from work that evening and find her body. What Sacramento police detectives walked into that night was, in the words of Lieutenant Biondi, one of the most disturbing crime scenes any of them had ever seen. Out of respect for Teresa Wallen and her family, we are not going to catalog what was done to her. What matters for the investigation is this. Whoever killed her had entered through an unlocked front door, had used a handgun rather than a rifle, and had spent time in the home after her death. This was not a burglary interrupted. This was something else entirely. Crime scene technicians recovered a partial shoe print in the bathroom. They recovered .22 caliber shell casings, and they began the slow process of trying to connect this to anything else in the region. Within days, ballistics would suggest a possible link to the Griffin shooting, but nothing was yet certain. 4 days later, on January 27, 1978, that uncertainty ended in the worst possible way. In a house on Marywood Drive, less than a mile from where Teresa Wallen had been killed, a neighbor discovered the bodies of 4 people. Evelyn Meredith, 38, her 6-year-old son Jason, a family friend named Danny Meredith, 51, and Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew David Ferreira, who had been in her care that day. 3 bodies were found inside the house. The infant was missing. This is where the case shifted from a regional homicide investigation to a national manhunt. Investigators quickly determined that the killer had entered through an unlocked back door. Danny Meredith appeared to have been the first victim, shot at close range. Meredith's wallet was missing, and his red station wagon was gone from the driveway. The killer had then moved through the house. Evelyn Meredith was found in her bedroom. Her son Jason was found in the same room. The crime scene, once again, contained elements that pointed to something far beyond a simple robbery or a domestic dispute. Detectives noted a bloody bathtub. They noted that the killer had at some point during the crime apparently eaten food from the refrigerator, and they noted the absence of the infant. The search for David Ferreira became one of the most urgent in Sacramento's history. Helicopters were dispatched. Volunteers combed nearby fields. FBI agents were called in, including a young profiler named Robert Ressler, whose work on this case would later become foundational in the development of modern criminal profiling. Ressler would go on to write about Chase extensively in his books, and it was Ressler who articulated the profile that ultimately narrowed the search. The profile Ressler developed, and which he later described in detail in his memoir Whoever Fights Monsters, predicted a white male in his mid to late 20s, thin, undernourished, unkempt, unemployed, living alone in filthy conditions and suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Ressler predicted the killer would live within a short walking distance of the crime scenes because the initial victim, Ambrose Griffin, had been killed nearby. And disorganized offenders of this type tend to hunt in a small, familiar radius. Ressler predicted the killer would have a history of psychiatric hospitalization, and Ressler predicted, crucially, that the killer would still have items taken from the crime scenes because he would be incapable of destroying evidence in any organized way. Every single element of that profile turned out to be correct. The break in the case came, as breaks so often do, from an ordinary citizen. A woman named Nancy Holden had gone to high school with Richard Chase. She had run into him at a shopping mall shortly before the murders, and the encounter had disturbed her deeply. He had appeared gaunt, dirty, and paranoid, and had asked her strange questions about a motorcycle accident involving a mutual acquaintance. When the composite descriptions of the suspect were released to the public, Holden contacted the Sacramento police and gave them Richard Chase's name. Detectives went to the Watt Avenue apartment on January 27th, the same day the Meredith house had been discovered. Chase refused to open the door. Officers set up surveillance. When Chase eventually left the apartment carrying a box, they moved in. In his hand, he was carrying a box containing bloody rags. In his pocket, they found Danny Meredith's wallet. In his waistband, they found a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, later confirmed by ballistics to be the weapon used in both the Wallen and Meredith homicides. And then they entered the apartment. This is the third detail promised at the start of this video, and it is the one investigators have said in interviews across decades they cannot forget. Inside Richard Chase's refrigerator, detectives found human remains in food storage containers. They found blood in a blender. The walls of the apartment were smeared with blood, some of it animal, some of it human. They found dozens of small animal carcasses, evidence of months of escalating experimentation. They found notes and calendars. On his calendar, on the dates of the Griffin killing, the Wallen killing, and the Unearthed killings, Chase had written the word "today." Investigators found the same word written on more than 40 additional future dates. What that calendar suggested was that the killings were not going to stop. Richard Chase had planned to continue on a schedule for the rest of the year. But before we get to what happened next, there is the matter of David Ferreira, the missing infant. Chase, during questioning, was evasive. The search continued for months. It was not until late March 1978 that a church custodian discovered the infant's remains in a box in a vacant lot near a church in Sacramento. It was one of the most painful discoveries of the entire investigation, and we will say no more about it here, except that the Ferreira family and the Unearthed family have carried this loss for nearly half a century, and their grief deserves to be named without spectacle. Richard Chase was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in San Jose in January 1979, after a change of venue due to the intense publicity in Sacramento. His defense attempted to argue that he should be found guilty of second-degree murder on the grounds of his severe mental illness, acknowledging that he had committed the acts, but arguing that he lacked the capacity to premeditate. The prosecution argued, and the jury agreed, that the calendar, the choice of unlocked homes, the theft of Meredith's car and wallet, and the fact that Chase had repeatedly tried locked doors and moved on when they did not open, all demonstrated planning and awareness. On May 8, 1979, Richard Chase was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. He would not live to see an execution date. On December 26, 1980, guards at San Quentin found Richard Chase dead in his cell. He had saved up antidepressants that had been prescribed to him and had taken them all at once. He was 30 years old. He had killed 6 people in the space of 1 month. The state, in the end, did not decide when he died. He did. And here is where the case becomes something larger than itself, because Richard Chase did not vanish from history when he died in that cell. Robert Ressler and his colleagues at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit interviewed Chase before his death as part of the landmark study that would eventually produce the organized versus disorganized offender typology that shaped the field of criminal profiling for the next generation. Chase became, in a sense, the textbook example of the disorganized offender. Chaotic crime scenes, weapons of opportunity, victims chosen by proximity rather than fantasy, no attempt to conceal evidence, and a severe underlying mental illness that made the perpetrator instantly identifiable to anyone who knew him. But the deeper story, and the more uncomfortable one, is not about profiling. It is about a system that had multiple chances to intervene. Chase had been involuntarily committed. He had been diagnosed. He had been observed drinking the blood of animals inside a psychiatric facility. He had been released. He had been taken off his medication. His family had raised concerns that went unaddressed. Neighbors had noticed his deterioration. He had been reported to police weeks before the Griffin killing for shooting at a neighbor's cows. He was, by every measurable definition, a person in acute psychiatric crisis, and the systems around him did not hold. Investigators who worked the case, including Lieutenant Biondi, have said in interviews over the years that the hardest part of the investigation was not solving it. The physical evidence in the profile pointed clearly to Chase within days. The hardest part was accepting how many warning signs had been visible, and for how long, and how little any of it had mattered until 6 people were dead. There are, of course, theories and debates that surround the case even now. Some writers have argued that Chase's mother bears more responsibility than she was ever held to for taking him off his medication in 1976. Others have argued that the psychiatric system of the late 1970s, in the wake of deinstitutionalization, simply had no mechanism to keep someone like Chase in supervised care once he was deemed stabilized. Still others have pointed to the earlier 1976 arrest of Chase in Nevada, where he had been found in a truck with a bucket of cow's blood and had been released without significant intervention. None of these observations excuse what Chase did. All of them are worth examining, because the question of how a person this visibly ill was allowed to remain outside of care is not a question about the 1970s. It is a question about now. The Vampire of Sacramento is a nickname the press gave Richard Chase because it was memorable and because it sold newspapers. It is not a name the victims chose, and it is not the frame the investigators of this case have ever preferred. Ambrose Griffin was a father and a husband coming home with groceries. Teresa Wallen was a young woman expecting her first child. Evelyn Miroth was a mother. Jason was 6 years old. Danny Meredith was a friend who had stopped by to check on someone. David Ferreira was less than 2 years old. Those are the 6 people at the center of this story. Everything else, including the name we still use for the man who killed them, is just how the world has tried, imperfectly, to make sense of what happened in a single month in Sacramento in the winter of 1977 and 1978. If this case stayed with you, subscribe to Dark Cases. Every week we examine another unsolved or unresolved case with the same care and the same commitment to the facts. Leave a comment with the case you want us to cover next, and share this video with someone who takes true crime seriously. We'll see you in the next one.